Now I'm delighted to introduce our first panel on the roots of and I'll introduce the moderator of the panel, and then he in turn will introduce our speakers. Daniel Cullen is a professor of political science at Rhodes College. He teaches political philosophy and the humanities there. He also directs the project for the study of liberal democracy. And he also is a senior fellow for constitutional studies at the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Constitutional Principles and History, and he serves on the academic council for the Jack Miller Center. His scholarship includes work on Rousseau's political philosophy. He's also written on liberal democracy and liberal education, on conservatism, democratic theory, free speech, and academic freedom. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dan Cullen.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here again. So our topic is the roots of partisanship and the possibility of civility. It promises you radical commentary, and I'm certain our panelists won't disappoint, although I don't know exactly what they will say. Indeed, I know nothing about what they will say. They chose to adopt the Ginsburg rules, the rules of the notorious RBG, no winks, no hints, no previews of what they would say. Partisanship and the possibility of civility. Is there a suggestion there that partisanship is incompatible with civility, or that polarization, the defining characteristic of contemporary politics, is perhaps the natural tendency of parties? If polarization is bad, i.e. not your usual disagreement, but a deep, unreasonable, even pathological disagreement, does it follow that partisanship is bad? Many people think so. And of course, we all know civility is good. It may not be possible, but we're sure it's necessary. I fear, though, which is to say, I fervently hope, that our panelists may upset some or all of those assumptions and set the room abuzz with controversy. There's no prohibition on fierce or even fighting words, but with last night's wonderful talk by Joanna Freeman in mind, no weapons, please. I'm going to introduce the panelists in reverse order of their appearance, not by listing their accomplishments, some of which, and only some of which, are in your program. Instead, I'll try to convey a little bit of what I think is their radicalism, which especially qualifies them for this topic. Tom Kelly studies the epistemology of disagreement, asking how rational subjects assess evidence and justify their beliefs. He calls attention to the phenomenon of belief polarization, the apparently unnatural and unexpected result that disagreement is not cured or even lessened by exposure to common evidence. Rather, when you and I disagree, take in the same evidence, our tendency is to fixate on our existing beliefs and resist amending them. This is bad news for the faith in enlightenment. Instead of bridging the gap between us, we become increasingly polarized, even in the face of new evidence. So are we human beings unreasonable, dogmatic, incapable of impartiality? As I understand Professor Kelly, he thinks there's more to the story, and that our affective and cognitive tendencies may be open to reform. I hope he'll say something about that and how it might bear on the larger themes of the conference. If you ask Teresa Bejan whether civility is possible, she'll first ask you, whose civility do you mean? Mr. Hobbes, Mr. Locke, or the correct answer, Mr. Roger Williams? She's written an important and discomforting book arguing that civility is overrated. We need to define civility down. What we need is not more civility, but mere civility, a deliberately low standard, so far before goodness, she says. It's even compatible with contempt for others. This will be news to people like my mother and to certainly college deans all across America. Teresa is especially hard on the demand for respect, which is the new coin of the realm. Civility, rightly understood as mere civility, can't rest too much on respect for the other. Well, what good then does mere civility do for us? I think her biggest claim is this: thinking through the concept of mere civility reveals that, and I'm quoting, while social life requires common ground, it requires much less than we think. This is because our judgments of incivility are inevitably partial to ourselves and to our sect. Teresa's advice to contemporary political theorists is, be less aspirational. We ought to define our social expectations down to, I quote again from her excellent book, "For when real human beings encounter different opinions, they conclude not that their differences are reasonable byproducts of the burdens of judgment, but that their opponents are bigoted, ignorant, malicious, and even insane. People, they're the worst." Civility, rightly understood, is not a science, but a virtue of muddling through, of democracy surviving its own strongest tendencies. Mere civility, she says, aims to keep a conversation going, but not resolve it. It is impressive enough, she thinks, that we air our differences, that we agree to disagree disagreeably, so to speak, and that we tolerate our mutual contempt for each other. Well, last year in this very spot, I described Harvey Mansfield as America's greatest living political scientist, and I'm afraid I made him blush. But I'm totally justified in that belief, and as Tom Kelly would expect, I only intend to double down on it. Our conference includes many of Harvey's students, and you can make your own inferences about him from them. A long time ago, I was almost a student of Mansfield's. In the eyes of the Harvard administration, though, I was undocumented. We impoverished graduate students at Boston College would occasionally ford the Charles River, only to arrive at the Great Wall surrounding the Harvard Yard. We'd caravan to the seminar once a week. But there was a big, beautiful gate right there on Mass Ave, and Harvey never took attendance. As Teresa Bejan tries to recover the virtue of mere civility, Harvey explains and defends the virtue of partisanship. A defense is necessary because parties are not respectable, and there's a long-standing prejudice that they're positively bad for democracy. His first book was devoted to Edmund Burke's defense of party government, including the paradoxical claim that the national interest would be promoted by parties striving to impose their particular principles on politics. Parties not only disagree, he says, they oppose each other, and so they address each other, even as they assert their rival principles. Is it surprising that this opposition generates a lot of disrespect and mutual contempt? But still, one might note, the parties continue to address each other, and something about their intense disagreement keeps them from sinking down into mere factionalism. Harvey criticizes the way political science looks at parties, observing its strange failure to look at the thoughts of partisans or to take them as seriously as they take interests. Finding interests, they think, is a more reliable guide to motivation, but it neglects that imposition of principle that Burke emphasized, and the way in which the assertion even of a partisan principle seems to point beyond itself by inviting consideration of its truth. This is what strikes me about Harvey Mansfield. He sees everything that the political scientists see, and he has a gift for expressing their insights in his own lapidary formulations. As his hero Tocqueville might put it, he seeks to see not differently than the political scientists, but farther than they do, blocked as they are by their principled refusal to follow fact into value. A more natural political science would acknowledge that terms like leader are not neutral. Otherwise, no one would ever complain about being misled, he says. And it would also inquire of the parties whether their polarizing principles are true or just as they claim. I expect our discussions over the next 2 days will sort some of this out, but there's no better way to begin than by hearing from Harvey Mansfield. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much for that introduction, that fulsome introduction, Dan. I think you've given my talk, so maybe we can proceed to the next one. But just out of your mouth, it came out pretty boastful, I have to say. But I'll see what I can whether I can be as boastful and proud of what I actually say now. Polarization. Should we fear it as an aberration, or should we accept it as something to be expected? I'm going to take the latter view and make a modest defense of polarization. This is in contrast to the preceding speaker, Jonathan Rhodes, but I have to say I pretty much agreed with most everything he said, except for his devotion to modern psychology. That troubled me. But I do think that polarization has a root in human nature even, which needs to be explored. And I'm going to base my talk on two of my favorites, Aristotle and Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville, as my late wife has recently argued, is Aristotle's modern representative. Now, Aristotle has a certain equanimity in the face of our partisan differences, as he says that every society is based on two regimes, not one. And the two regimes are democracy and oligarchy. And Tocqueville agrees with this, with the difference that he says we live in a democratic era, so that all partisan tendencies in our regimes are going to have a democratic cast to them. And so instead of speaking of democracy versus oligarchy, he says that every free society has two parties in it, two great parties, those who want to extend the power of the people and those who want to restrict it. So the restrictionist party is really the oligarchical party, more modestly presented. Today we have liberals in the Democratic Party and conservatives in the Republican Party, and I think they pretty much correspond to these two tendencies of all societies. And since we live in a democratic era, the Republicans cannot be, or certainly not present themselves, as oligarchical. The democracy is a party of quantity, of all. The Democrats believe that society is the whole of all as individuals. And therefore, individuals have to be equal, because if they weren't equal, some of them would be inferior, and those people wouldn't be included. Equality is for the sake of community, it seems. If there were not equality, those left out would be marginalized. They wouldn't belong to the society. In order to make everybody belong, you have to make everybody belong equally. Because the Republicans are the party of quality. They cannot make they cannot make a society of obvious inequalities in such a way as they would come to represent or seem to represent the party of the few. So, for example, when Romney got caught saying that 47% of Americans, say, so to speak, don't qualify for the Republican Party because they're takers, not givers, that was a political mistake. So they don't simply confine themselves to the few, although they do represent the rich, and rich not only in the sense of the wealthy, but wealthy or rich in the sense of intelligence, capacity, being the founders, the creators, people with outstanding virtue. Now, you can find this kind of virtue also in the American people generally, as Republicans try to do, when they understand virtue as earning. To be virtuous is to earn your living, as opposed to those who depend on others for their livelihood. So you can democratize that, following, for example, the views of Abraham Lincoln in a speech he gave in 1859 to the Wisconsin State Fair in praise of American workers, who were in those days, of course, mostly farmers. And he said that the American worker is not a peasant or a serf who works in everything the way his fathers and his ancestors did, but he's always looking for some way to improve what he does. And therefore he makes a distinction between doing a thing and doing it well. That is a possible democratic distinction, which is, I think, very much part of the Republican creed. No society would be possible in this view, except that some people are better than others. And without that, that society couldn't exist. Even if everybody were equal, they would still need artisans, workers, experts to make democracy come into being. Democratic is different from demotic. Demotic means simply popular in the sense that everybody is the same. Democracy is a society which is based on that principle and therefore requires unequal people to make equality possible or viable. So these are 2 points of view. That society is essentially a community of all, and especially all equally, or that a society is a community of the capable, including the all, but favoring the capable, those who contribute. So each opposes the other, and yet each has to recognize somehow the other point of view. The Republicans are vulnerable because they always tend to represent the few. They're the oligarchy party in a democratic era. Therefore, they have to get votes in order to win and persuade people that their distinctiveness, their love of distinctiveness, their judgmentalism is for their good. Whereas the Democrats, of course, need the help of outstanding individuals. They too like virtue, but they want virtue only in pursuit of equality and not virtue as such, or rewarded and honored as such. And you could say more generally that quantity and quality in our thinking are always combined. A quantity is always a quantity of some quality. Say, a quantity of apples consists of a quantity of things which have the quality, each of them, of an apple. And on the other hand, quality needs quantity. Quantity gives force. Only one virtuous person can't live by himself alone. He depends on others less virtuous than he to survive. These two viewpoints are reasonable, but they argue with each other. The two poles may dislike each other, but they have to live with each other. And in doing so, they argue. Politics is about an argument. It's not just attitudes or moods or dislikes and dislikes, but at its best, it's an argument. Anyone who is in politics is thinking of the argument against the other side every day. What's come out? Yeah. How do we answer? What do we say that will surprise them or put them in difficulty? So you're always mindfully and necessarily preoccupied with how the other person is going to receive your argument, and your argument is so it's and therefore it becomes very difficult to decide who is responsible for our polarization. And that's because each side is always addressing the other. Is it the Republicans who are responsible because of the Southern strategy initiated by President Nixon, which brought the South into the Republican camp? Or is it the Democrats who are responsible because they invited in the New Left in the late 1960s, which expelled liberals from the Republican Party? So these political science neglects these ideas and tries to use the notion of preferences. You see this a lot in political science literature. They adopt a term taken out of economics that refers to consumer preferences. In economics, it has an existence because it seems to offer a way of being scientific about something that economists tend to think is unscientific, namely people's values. So it's decided that you can't say that one thing or one item is better than another, but you can say that that there is one of them is preferable to another. That's a kind of behavioral point of view. So preferences, as if the two parties had preferences. I prefer vanilla, you prefer chocolate. But that doesn't work in politics because people who prefer vanilla have no reasonable desire to abolish chocolate. In politics, let's take the abortion issue. It's different. And the abortion issue, the party against it says, or the party in favor of it says that a woman isn't free unless she has control over her own body. And the party against it says a woman who kills a developing human being in her own body for the sake of convenience, her convenience, is doing a wrong. So you might say, why don't the people who favor abortions have abortions, and those who don't have abortions don't have them? and settle the matter on that point, in that way. But the trouble is that both sides would be unhappy. Each side wants a society in which everybody takes their point of view. This is what partisanship is. It's a desire of the part to rule the whole. We can see some evidence for this in the two parties. Let me give some examples. Democrats desire to extend the power of the people, as Tocqueville says. In their understanding, democracy is not so much the rule of the people that presently exists, as it is a future condition toward which our imperfectly democratic society is moving, if with the fits and starts corresponding to electoral triumphs and disappointments. Its actual movement accords both with the way things should go and the grander movement of history. Democracy must democratize itself. It is essentially not a settled state, as in we live in a democracy, but a revolution bringing ever more democracy. In becoming ever more democratic, democracy moves in a direction of what Aristotle calls the demotic, toward ever greater simplicity and universality, or as they say today, towards inclusiveness. Inclusiveness in what? In a whole. But which whole? America, of course, but Democrats want an America that is not distinct from the rest of the world, but rather as part of it. Are the Democrats therefore not patriotic? Their patriotism exists, but not for an America superior to other countries. It is a patriotism mindful of other patriotisms. An American citizen should aspire to be a world citizen, rather than strut around dressed in the garb of Uncle Sam, disparaging other countries. Inclusiveness becomes visible in practice in the foreign policy of Democrats. For example, in the tour of apologetic speeches for American conduct made by President Obama in 2009 at the beginning of his presidency. Leading from behind, the phrase of a supporter was for him not Machiavellian cunning, but genuine deference to the sensibilities of other countries, representing other cultures equal to the American. It was the farthest thing from insistence on being first in any regard except that of deference. The immigration issue that is lively now shows Democrats eager for welcoming new citizens, especially the needy and least advantaged, who come to America to be safe rather than because it is free. If in coming they should happen to break immigration law, this is no more serious than coming without documents. The environment is a favorite issue for Democrats, as it affects everybody across barriers and boundaries. It is a world problem all countries must address, so as to cooperate in the interest of all humanity, even all life. It gets more attention today than assuring world peace by preventing war, perhaps because it lacks the ambiguity in the means to the goal of world peace between frightening aggressors, as Republicans support, and pacifying them, as Democrats prefer. Awareness of danger to the environment seems to unite, hence include, all humans unequivocally in a common and mutual awareness of our vulnerability. Democrats look to vulnerability, to the most vulnerable humans, as the most representative of the vulnerability of all humans. A liberal, one could say, is a person who spends his life looking for people to be sorry for, also animals to be sorry. Vulnerability is the most universal feature of human life, and so paradoxically, the most secure basis for life as a whole. Now turning to Republicans, whom I call a party of virtue as opposed to inclusiveness, even though I know that many will gag in astonished disgust. Even Republicans fear to assert such a claim. Once upon a time, when they enacted prohibition of alcohol in the name of virtue, the reaction gave them their fill of that word. So they prefer to be known as the Party of Liberty, but they demand liberty without license, liberty properly exercised, which means liberty with virtue. Because they insist on the good behavior that follows from virtue, they look down on those who lack it. Democrats would say that Republicans are the party of money, not virtue. But Republicans believe that they earn their money as a regular result of their virtue. Democrats doubt this claim. They think that money is luck, and that perhaps even virtue is luck, to the extent that it is inherited rather than achieved or earned, as Republicans want to say of virtue. It takes a village, that is a community, a whole, to achieve what achievers fondly and wrongly believe is their own doing. Republicans reply that a whole composed of equal participants would be indifferent to the virtue that went into the creation and continues in the maintenance and supervision, virtue which deserves honor and reward. Well, that's just a small sample of the kind of argument which takes place. Let me end with an objection to the Aristotelian equanimity that looks on both these tendencies as reasonable. Tocqueville spoke of the democratic era, which he says exists as far as the eye can see. And this doesn't mean, it's not because democracy is the whole truth of human nature and nature. It isn't, but because democracy is so powerful and promises to stay that way. Democracy democratizes. It's true of all regimes. All regimes like more of what they presently do, more than anything else. Okay. But democracy tends to lead to extreme democracy or extreme equality. That's a phrase from Montesquieu, a liberal philosopher who also has a kind of equanimity about him. But take a look, for my last point, take a look at today's progressives and their progressivism. They understand this process of democratizing as a movement of history, which is characterized by progress. What is progress? Progress is moving toward an end believed to be good, in this case, greater and greater equality. Oh, this end is never, or perhaps rarely, defined. It's not even defined in the Green New Deal, although that goes further towards a definition, I would say, of the end of progress. But this movement towards an end, which is irreversible, that is the crucial qualification of the understanding of the progressives. Progress has to be irreversible. We won't be going back. We can't go back. Progress as a mere improvement on things is not enough, because a mere improvement towards ever greater equality might mean that the oligarchs are still there waiting for their turn, so to speak, promised to them by Aristotle and by Tocqueville. So there are signs of irreversible progress. The abolition of slavery. Who's going to go back to slavery? The civil rights movement. Who's going to go back to segregation? On the other hand, there is the barbarism, so a lot worse than tribalism, of 20th century totalitarianism, which put on a display or a show of barbarism that shames the barbarians. Also, Republicans look at recent party history and they say to themselves and to each other, we're always yielding ground. And yet, the Republicans have had considerable success electorally. In the last half century, they've won about half the elections. Part of the reason, perhaps, for polarization is that both parties think they have a chance to win on each occasion. And so there isn't, as it seems, a majority party and a minority party. And the minority party must resign itself to failure. This happens in most American states, but not in the because most American states are one-party states, as was said earlier. But it doesn't seem to be the case for the country. So is Aristotle out of date? Has he passed his expiration date because of the success of progress, or is he still alive, waiting it out, graciously, invitingly, mysteriously? I'll end with one remark about civility, because that's the topic of today, right? Civility is nourished by a sense of permanence in the other guy's opinion. If your opponent can be destroyed or disposed of, why should you be tolerant? Why should you be so nice? But this point of view, this Aristotelian equanimity, I call it, gives a foundation for civility. Thank you.
Teresa.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks to Dan for that very kind introduction and for doing me the honor of reading my book, but also perhaps the disservice of understanding it and paraphrasing it better than I ever could. But I'm gonna give it a go here, but also to reflect some of the ways in which perhaps my own thinking has developed beyond my argument in mere civility, which isn't to say that you shouldn't buy it. You should. And, it's on Amazon, low price. Okay, great. So I'm here to talk about the civility part of the equation, beginning sort of about what it is, maybe more importantly, what it isn't, and also whether or not it's not even simply possible, but if possible, what good it might do to a divided polity like this one. Of course, the sense that American democracy is facing a crisis of division, and that should be understood as a crisis of civility specifically, is not exactly new. And of course, I'll defer to the authority of Joanne Freeman in her remarks later to talk about the perennial nature of that fear in American politics. But just to give you a sense of my own history, I began writing on civility as a graduate student in 2008. At that time, a newly elected President Obama had made America's civility crisis a point of central concern, and his newly appointed chairman of the National Endowment of the Humanities, Jim Leach, was embarking on a 50-state civility tour, right? To bring the good word to the people that we needed to be nicer to each other. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, we can say that perhaps at best it did little good, at worst such efforts spectacularly backfired. And it's not really difficult, I think, to see why. Although Americans across the political spectrum can generally agree that there's something like a lack of civility in American public discourse, and they can even agree that it would be good to have more civility in our public discourse, it's never clear exactly what we mean by civility and what it would require of us. On the surface, right, just on the level of definitions, civility seems to be a kind of conversational virtue, one that's particularly important in the practice of disagreement. And not just all disagreements, but a certain set of disagreements in particular, those that I would describe as somehow fundamental to our worldviews and to our identities. You know the kinds of disagreements I mean. You know, one doesn't discuss religion and politics at the dinner table because these are the things that we really seriously disagree about, and we define ourselves against our opponents in the controversy. This is something that's passing under the label of tribalism today. I just want to sort of flag about whether or not that's the most helpful way of understanding that dynamic. Right, so as such, as this kind of conversational virtue pertinent to disagreement, people tend to treat civility or assume civility is just a synonym for politeness, for good manners, for respect. But of course, to accuse someone of being uncivil is much, much worse than calling them impolite. Because to call someone uncivil is a way of signaling that they are somehow beyond the pale, as it were. That's a phrase with its own very interesting history, but that they're not worth engaging with at all. So it shouldn't be surprising that when it comes to American politics, incivility always turns out to be the sin of the other side. Incivility is always the sin of our opponents, not ourselves. And one also can't help but notice that talking about civility then, so complaining about incivility on the one hand and calling for more civility on the other, has become an excellent strategy for disengaging with our opponents. It's a little bit like taking one's ball and going home, an excuse for our disengaging and excusing ourselves from the debate. So noticing this dynamic of civility talk, right, has led a lot of people, both on the right and on the left, to be suspicious that so much civility talk, calling for civility, is just a fancy way of telling the people who have the temerity to disagree with you to shut up. It's a way of shutting up your opponents and shutting down debate. And so it was noticing that dynamic and my own deep skepticism of civility talk. I mean, so the civility is overrated. Recently I gave a TED talk and my proposed title was, Is Civility Bullshit? But they wouldn't let me use that title because of content warnings, and indeed they did put a content warning on my talk. But in any case, led me to start looking into the history of civility in order to understand what it was, really, and why it seemed to matter so much. And as many here will know, certainly Harvey, the concept of civility has its origins in classical Latin, in the word civilitas, which describes a virtue of, or art, of good government or citizenship. And so the root, of course, there is civitas, meaning civil society or state. Now, noticing this, modern commentators are often tempted to turn modern civility into a kind of catch-all yay term for civic virtue, public spirit, respectfulness, and even political friendship, so for neo-Aristotelians among us. But as I point out in my book, the origins of the modern sense of civility as specifically a conversational virtue that's supposed to help us disagree, the origins of that lie elsewhere. So I argue that civility in that sense is actually a product of post-Reformation debates in Europe about religious toleration. Specifically, it was invented by people who were confronting the very real and very difficult challenge of how to coexist unmurderously with people and views they not only believed, but they knew to be damned. You know, so far, so familiar, right? The hope of thinkers at the time was that the virtue of civility might make it possible for Christians and non-Christians alike to share a life even when they didn't share a faith. And I suppose I should be explicit. When I say Christians, I mean whatever, pick your denomination, every so-called Christian at that time believed anyone who disagreed with them was a non-Christian. So, you know, just sometimes it can present a difficulty for modern scholars looking back at early modern polemics. They see this term anti-Christian being thrown around and they think that refers to atheists. No, 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 anti-Christian is just the Protestant way of referring to a Catholic because they're a follower of the Antichrist, the Pope. right? So, so how do people who believe that, believe their opponents are followers of the Antichrist, how can they share a life even when they don't share a faith? So as Dan mentioned, different thinkers at the time imagined the virtue of civility that would be required differently. But I think all began to see it as a kind of conversational virtue that was going to make fundamental disagreement tolerable. Because as philosophers at the time, above all Thomas Hobbes, realized, disagreeable is a synonym for unpleasant for a reason. So Hobbes points out that the mere act of disagreement is offensive because when you disagree with someone on one point, you're accusing them of reasoning incorrectly. If you disagree with them on a number of points, it's tantamount to calling them a fool, says Hobbes. So disagreement itself is an insult to your views and to your intelligence. So the idea that civility could make that bearable wasn't the sense that it would make disagreement no longer disagreeable, but it would make it possible to muddle through and put up, to rub along together. So to be merely civil then was to meet a low bar grudgingly. Civility described a ceiling and not a floor. And this was, described a floor and not a ceiling. And this was, of course, in contrast to spirituality or charity, which was the standard of true spiritual goodness, right? The standard of civility was necessarily going to be lower than the standard of righteousness or religious truth. And so the poster child for mere civility on my view is, of course, Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, a man who, even though he was a Puritan of the most uncompromising spiritual standards, and I'm not kidding here, right? He never met a church that he wouldn't separate from on the grounds that it was corrupt. At the end of his life, he was worshiping in a congregation of only two, him and his wife, and he wasn't sure about her. Right? Anyway, but Roger Williams, despite, or I would argue because of his spiritual intolerance, he ends up in Rhode Island founding the most tolerant society that the world had ever seen. And the key to coexistence, as he saw it, was mere civility, which meant, on his view, a willingness to conform to contingent standards of respectful behavior, despite our contempt for others and their views. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, as Williams' critics pointed out, it meant that Williams was endorsing a kind of hypocrisy in civil matters for the sake of sincerity in spiritual matters. So Quaker critics pointed out that Williams would take off his hat to everyone as he walked down the street in town: men, women, children, American Indians, Catholics, Jews, right? And the Quakers abhorred this because, of course, if you're a Quaker, you keep your hat on as a matter of conscience, right? Anyway, but for Williams, the occasionally contemptuous performance of doffing and donning your hat was an essential expression of a sort of more fundamental continued willingness to live with and engage with your neighbors despite their errors, and indeed because of their errors. Because the point of mere civility was to make coexistence possible and also to make evangelism possible, to make it possible to live with sinners so that one could continually witness against their errors. Not behind their backs, but to their faces. I'll remind you again, Roger Williams was highly obnoxious. Even he acknowledged that his expulsion from Massachusetts Bay had had something to do with his constant admonishing of them in their unclean walking. Right. So the point of mere civility was it was less a matter of fetishizing or worrying about the kinds of words you were using, right? So today we worry a lot about hate speech or religious insult. Civility in this sense wasn't about the kinds of words. It was about one's commitment to using one's words to one's opponent's face and not behind her back, to talking to, not at or past one another. So the point of being merely civil was to continue to disagree and disagree fundamentally, to witness against error and injustice, but to do so without denying or destroying the possibility of a common life tomorrow with the people we believe to be standing in our way today. So on that view, I think that civility is indeed a virtue that's in short supply today, as we were hearing in the first lecture, a day in which technologies like social media make it possible for people, or make it easier than ever for people to associate only with the like-minded, to assume the worst of their opponents and say so, not to them or for their own sake, but for the sake of building solidarity with the in-group. And at the same time, those technologies have erased the distinction between people's backs and fronts. It's impossible to say something behind someone's back on Twitter. We're all facing each other, and the circular firing squad is proceeding apace. So, noticing this, right, so if I'll accept the idea that there's a crisis of civility in American politics, I'll also accept that civility, as I've described it, is possible. There remains the question, however, whether or not more civility, even on my model, really is the solution. I tend to think that the crisis of civility in American politics today is a symptom, not a cause, of deeper ills, and I'd be happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. But I will say that more civility can't hurt, and on that point I'll just say civility begins at home. It begins with you and your trigger Twitter finger, right? So if we're spending all of our time talking about civility so as to point out that our opponents are doing it wrong, it's really we who are doing it wrong. And if talking about civility becomes an excuse for never actually engaging with people who seriously disagree with you, well, you're doing it wrong. Thank you.
Tom Kelly.
So first, thank you to Arizona State and SCETL. I just learned that acronym this morning. I like it. For putting on this event, and the organizers for all the organizing, and for inviting me out. We appreciate the chance to come out and participate. So I'd like to talk about some of the mechanisms that underlie political polarization. I should say right at the outset, I tend to be quite pessimistic about these issues. Like many people, I agree that increasing political polarization is a bad thing. I also think things are more likely to get worse rather than better on this front. In particular, I'm inclined to think that even on the relatively optimistic assumption that many people from across the political spectrum will think and act rationally, polarization is still likely to get worse, given certain very general facts about the world and American society circa 2019. So in some respects, I think that the situation we're in resembles a classic collective action problem. At the level of the group, there's this undesirable outcome that we'd like to avoid, increasing fragmentation, political polarization. And this can be recognized as an undesirable outcome by people across the political spectrum. But nevertheless, at the individual level, people will often have strong reasons to think and act in ways that have the following property. When lots of similarly situated people think and act in those same ways, this predictably exacerbates the problem at the level of the group or the level of the whole. So first, just at a purely psychological level, it's worth bearing in mind just how robust the polarization phenomenon is. So there's this, one of the seminal papers in this area done decades ago that's been replicated many times since, has a nice title, Biased Assimilation and Attitude Polarization, the Effects of Prior Theories on Subsequently Considered Evidence. So this is the classic study in which they start with two groups of people, half of whom start off thinking that, it's an empirical question. Does the death penalty, capital punishment, have a deterrent effect on the commission of murder? And they start with the two groups of people, half of whom start off thinking, yes, it does, half of whom start off thinking, no, it doesn't. And then they bombard the group of people with studies. And it's the same studies, it's kind of mixed evidence. Some studies seem to suggest that capital punishment is a deterrent, some seem to suggest that it isn't. And so you might hope and expect in these circumstances for some kind of convergence, right? As the body of total evidence that's available to all the people increasingly comes to consist of common items over time, people get drawn closer together. But notoriously, that's not what happens. Not only don't people in those circumstances get drawn closer together, but they diverge further and further, right? The people who start off thinking that capital punishment is a deterrent become more confident of their opinion. People who start off thinking the opposite become more confident of their opinion. People end up even further apart, right? And there are different models of how people are thinking about their evidence, what's going on in these cases and so on. As Daniel mentioned, I'm very interested in this kind of thing in my own research, some of my own research. But of course, I also acknowledge that is a very special case in which the people who start off disagreeing with one another actually get the same evidence or information, after they are identified as disagreeing. I take it one of the most significant facts in this general area is that in the real world, that is the world outside of the psychology laboratory, people who start off with opposing views are not getting the same information or putative information. Right? There's not some common body of evidence that's being given to people on both sides of the issue. People get their information from very different sources who often tell them quite different things. And crucially, which sources people rely on and how much they trust those sources is not at all independent of their first-order political views, right? So progressives watch MSNBC, conservatives watch Fox News, and so on. And of course, so here's just one of the basic structural facts we're dealing with, for better or for worse. The current diversity of sources of information about political matters is absolutely unprecedented in history. In fact, by historical standards, it's unprecedented by orders of magnitude, right? And lots of people have recently talked a lot about this, so I won't belabor it. But in some ways, you might think, look, this is kind of a deeply irrational state of affairs, members of the same political community, living at the same time, interested in the same issues, relying on different sources, ending up with radically different views, in part because they're relying on different sources of information. On the other hand, at the level of the individual, it's often surprisingly difficult to make the charge of irrationality stick. I don't mean to be skeptical. No doubt many people are very irrational about politics and arrive at their views about politics in very irrational ways. But we can also ask questions like this. If people were more rational than they actually are, would you still get the same kind of effects, polarization effects, or something quite similar? I think you would. I suspect you would, as long as people differ significantly in the evidence that they have about which sources are reliable, the extent to which these sources are reliable, and as long as people differ in their beliefs about such matters, as they will, then it will be rational, I think, for different people to rely on different sources to different degrees in ways that make for further differences downstream, what evidence they end up having, what information they get exposed to, what they end up believing on the basis of that information or putative information. And a lot can be said about this, but just one intuitive thought is, if you do, as people generally do, have beliefs about which sources are relatively reliable when it comes to information about political matters, there does seem like to be something deeply irrational about setting aside or bracketing those beliefs when you go about gathering information to the extent you do that. And for me, it's kind of interesting to think about these issues from the perspective of my own discipline, philosophy, and the history of philosophy. So one of the big moments in the history of philosophy, I noticed there was one of the undergraduates asked a question in the first session, nice, very excellent question. The first session was a philosophy major here at ASU. One of the big moments in the history of Western philosophy, some people consider it the beginning of so-called modern philosophy, is Descartes has this, in his Meditations on First Philosophy, has this apparently compelling thought. He says, look, I've noticed, now that I've reached a certain level of maturity, I've noticed that lots of things I currently believe, what are they? They're opinions I uncritically inherited in my youth, right? So now that I've kind of reached the age of reason, so to speak, here is the intellectually responsible thing for me to do, Descartes thinks, bracket my current opinions and only reaffirm my commitment to those opinions that I can now independently substantiate from some perfectly neutral, unbiased starting point. Right? So that's kind of Descartes' picture of how an ideally rational thinker would go about dealing with the situation he finds himself in, having inherited all these prejudices and so on in his youth. Lots of subsequent thought about these topics, not just in philosophy, but by other people who theorize about rational belief, really embodies, whether consciously or not, the thought that Descartes' way of thinking about it is deeply misguided, fundamentally mistaken, that that's what rational belief consists in. So just to mention one example of this, a very popular theory of rational belief, certainly among philosophers, but among other bigger disciplines as well, Bayesian models of rational belief, where on this picture, you're never in a position of starting from scratch, like Descartes recommends for somebody in the situation with all of these biases and so on. Rather, you've always got some body of prior opinion or a prior probability distribution. And what's characteristic of the rational thinker is not to try to justify that starting point from some neutral, unbiased place. Rather, it's characteristic of the rational believer to update her existing opinions in certain ways when she encounters new information or new putative information. And then people have this worry, including Bayesians. Well, look, what happens if you're talking about people who have different prior bodies of opinion? What happens then? And Bayesians will actually try to prove, and succeed in some cases, prove mathematical theorems, right? Given certain constraints, people who start from different places will converge when they get the same evidence, right? But again, at best, that only works when you're talking about people getting the same evidence. In the real world political case, people with different prior views don't get the same evidence. In part, it's partially guaranteed by the fact that their prior views will influence where they look to get more information or putative information. And so you can have people, perfectly rational thinkers, who start with different evidence and because of that consult different sources and end up getting pushed further and further apart. Perfectly rational from the Bayesian perspective. Lots of other views of rational belief embody the same kind of idea, right? So at the end of the day, so it's kind of, from my point of view, it's kind of interesting to think in this context. At the end of the day, I think I agree with Descartes' critics. The very ambitious Cartesian project of justifying your convictions from some unbiased, neutral starting point. It's not just cognitively utopian, but it's not even really a rational ideal. On the other hand, that having been said, when I think about these issues in this kind of context, the political context involving polarization, people starting from different places, getting pushed further in that same direction, I feel the force of Descartes' thought that, look, if you're thinking about it in any way other than the way I'm recommending to you, kind of spotting yourself the starting point, so to speak, you're going to run into trouble, right? It's going to lead to trouble. I also want to mention another phenomenon that's relevant here. This is a well-confirmed empirical phenomenon, which is, it turns out that when you've got a group of people who are generally like-minded about some political issue, and they discuss that issue among themselves, they tend to become more extreme over time, right? So if you start off with a group of people, all of whom are in some sense, even if they disagree among themselves, to some extent, but they're all right of center with respect to some political issue or left of center, and they tend to become more extreme in the direction of the original political orientation, right? So the more moderate members get put on the defensive by the less moderate members of the group. So, maybe you're one of those rhinos, Republican in name only or something, right? And they start to think, well, no, I'm not a rhino, probably, I really am conservative, something like this. So the more moderate members get pushed to become less moderate, and the more extreme members of the group become even more extreme. So the group as a whole kind of shifts in a certain direction. In contrast, when you've got some evidence, when you've got discussion among a more ideologically diverse group of people, you don't get those same effects, at least in the same way. So you might think, yeah, in the light of that, those empirical facts, here's one thing we definitely don't want as a society. Groups of politically like-minded people to just go off and talk among themselves, whether online or face-to-face. That's a recipe for ending up with a bunch of groups, each of which has extreme opinions, which disagrees radically with the extreme opinions held by other groups, right, that have kind of segregated themselves in some sense. What we want is for people who are passionately interested in politics to regularly talk politics with people who belong to the opposite political party and so on, right? So it's kind of, now of course, even if that's what's desirable from the perspective of society as a whole, we can also ask questions again at the level of individual rationality. How often is it rational for people to seek out political conversations with other people who they know that they disagree strongly with, as opposed to cases in which it makes sense for them to talk politics with people with whom they generally agree about politics? And here you might worry, I kind of suspect and conjecture that there's something of a misalignment, that for many people, given the way they're embedded in the world, it might make more sense to seek out conversations with not that somebody you agree with about everything, but are generally like-minded about politics, as opposed to going for those conversations with people where you have deep disagreements, right? Members of the opposite party who disagree about many issues and so on. So just to try to warm you up to the way I'm thinking about this, what are the contexts in which people do come into contact regularly with people with whom they have substantial political disagreements. One context is family gatherings, right, involving members of one's extended family. So there's this kind of a familiar trope, it's a cultural cliche at this point. Every holiday season, the New York Times runs some feature with a title like How to Talk to Your Trump-Loving Uncle about politics at Thanksgiving. There's actually a whole genre here. If you Google your Trump-loving uncle, lots of stuff comes up. It turns out this is really Donald Trump's base of political support in this country, people's uncles, right? That's who's supporting the guy. And when I did this, I do want to give a brief shout out to the Denver Post. They had kind of an interesting riff or variation on this theme. One year they ran a piece entitled, How to Deal with Your Trump-Loving Uncle or Your Woke Niece at Thanksgiving. So that was kind of a nice attempt at balance or kind of symmetry, as opposed to only addressing the woke niece who faces this daunting prospect of talking politics with the Trump-loving uncle, also reaching out to the Trump-loving uncles among the readership and giving them advice about, yeah, what about when you talk to your woke niece, right? So I thought that was kind of nice. I agree, this is a perfectly legitimate question one can ask. Given that I'm a woke niece, and given for some reason I'm going to be talking politics with my Trump-loving uncle at Thanksgiving, how should I go about this? Can you give me any tips? No doubt there's better and worse ways to proceed for that kind of thing. Maybe there's even, you might think it's kind of obvious, but you might think maybe there's some kind of interesting empirical, surprising things about how to go about this. But I do think, although I acknowledge that's a legitimate question, I do think there's a prior question to which rational woke nieces will be sensitive. Namely this question in this neighborhood, given that I'm a woke niece and my uncle loves Trump, does it really make sense for me to talk politics with him at my aunt's Thanksgiving dinner, right? Is that rational, or at least a rational thing for me to do, given the available options in front of me, right? And of course, I think, what it's rational for any particular individual to do depends on the particularities of their situation, the circumstances they're in. There might be some woke nieces and some Trump-loving uncles where that really is the thing to do. Talking to one another about politics at Thanksgiving dinner really does maximize expected value or maximize expected utility. Plug in your favorite theory of practical rationality here. But I submit that given plausible assumptions, for most woke nieces and most Trump-loving uncles, this option typically won't float to the top as the most rational thing to do or tied to the most rational thing to do. Of course, one never knows, right? But you see how I'm thinking about this. Consider finally just a quite different context in which many people will have the opportunity, if they wanted to avail themselves of it, to talk politics with people who substantively disagree with them. Their workplace, right? So many Americans work in places that are politically and ideologically diverse. I don't. I'm an academic. I teach in an Ivy League school. So it's not an ideologically diverse environment, but many Americans do differ from me in this respect. I think, this is a great opportunity to have these conversations that in some sense we think would be good for society as a whole if people are talking politics with people with whom they really genuinely disagree, as opposed to, this is a chance for them to escape the ideological echo chamber of their Facebook friends or whatever, and have some certain kind of conversation they might not otherwise have. But again, we can ask, at the level of the individual, does it make sense? How often will it make sense to talk politics at your place of business with coworkers with whom you substantively disagree? I take it that to even pose that question in that way is to make salient the fact that many people typically will have strong reasons. I don't just mean like psychological reasons, I mean strong normative reasons, the kind of thing that tend to make it rational to do one thing rather than another, will have strong reasons to avoid talking politics with people at their place of work. And here is elsewhere, I think, a potentially useful heuristic in thinking about these questions at this kind of very abstract level is, what advice would you give your children? As my own children are still in grade school, but I imagine my son coming to me and telling me about his first real job and saying, look, my boss and I have this thing in common. We both have a passionate interest in politics, and we really like talking about politics. The only difference is my boss is a conservative Republican, and I'm a progressive Democrat, or vice versa, right? Would I encourage my son to talk politics with his boss in those circumstances, given that information? Absolutely not. I would actively discourage him, like, well, be very careful. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this. And I don't think it's only the less powerful person that will have that reason, that circumstance. I think often bosses will have very good reasons not to talk politics with their employee, the people working under them who disagree, and even coworkers, peers, working side by side, shoulder to shoulder, will often have very strong reasons to avoid conversations of the relevant sort. So we're kind of running behind on time, so let me stop there. It's going to have some conversation. I appreciate that much more would need to be said to make any of what I've been saying stick, but hopefully kind of getting the general drift of how I'm thinking about things and some of my concerns here. General theme, given the way people are embedded in the world often, and the kind of rational incentives they often face, if they think and act rationally in response to those incentives, this might very well make the polarization problem worse as opposed to better, given certain plausible assumptions. And there is this question about, well, what's desirable at the level of the group versus what will it make sense to individuals to do in the particular context in which they find themselves. Thank you very much.
I didn't really hear remedies there, but strangely, I feel better about our polarized future. We are going to have a lunch break soon, so let's invite the uncles and nieces immediately to the microphone, and let me pose a question, if you have it, to a particular panelist, and if any of you want to briefly add, please do, but we're going to go into soundbite response mode, given the time. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm not a niece, but I am a nephew to a few people. And this is a question directed to Dr. Bejan, because I've never been exposed to Roger Williams before, but I find it quite interesting. But being raised a pragmatist, I have to ask for some practical recommendations to really be able to judge this. And what I was thinking about was outrage culture, and especially cancel culture, how we call for the canceling of celebrities based on prior remarks of theirs and other behaviors that we deem to be undesirable. And if we take, for example, somebody like Kevin Hart, or most recently, the target of outrage is John Wayne, do we essentially say that you were a homophobe or you were a racist, and that's okay, we can forgive that, you can stay part of our popular culture and you can stay in front of our society? Or do we demand change from these people before we give them any more opportunities, like with Hart and the Oscars? It's just something that I think there's a lot of different approaches to, and we haven't come to an agreement on, so I wonder what your research would say about that.
My research, what about my just passionate following of popular culture and internet gossip? I was not aware of the John Wayne one. That's good. Yeah, thanks for that question. I guess I should say I wasn't familiar with Roger Williams either until I started doing my PhD. I'm from the American South, and I'm, raised lapsed Catholic, so I didn't really have any kind of dog in that fight. But I just found his practice in Rhode Island incredibly fascinating. And I guess this is a sort of maybe gentle maybe rebuke or addendum to Tom's presentation, and to say, isn't there scope for virtue in this? And what makes me think, what I like about Williams is that his practice was not rational on the basis of all the going theories about how we should engage with people who really disagree with us, and nevertheless it worked. So I think there's a sort of role for exemplarity in thinking with past figures. So I've just chosen him. You could choose others. On cancel culture and outrage, I really do. Jonathan Rausch brought up institutions, and as a member of the academy of a university, as a university teacher, I teach politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford. I see part of my role as trying to get my students to see that responses other than outrage are possible when we encounter things of which we disapprove or are horrified by. So what's the repertory of possible responses? And then also, just to sort of point out the arrogance of cancel culture. I mean, for me, what I learned from studying the history of political thought is just it's a counsel to epistemic humility, a kind of awareness of the limitations of my knowledge and my perspective and my views. That, to me, seems to be an essential part of what the institution of the university should do. I guess I'm just very disturbed by fellow academics who seem really excited to get on the outrage cancel bandwagon. That seems to be totally antithetical to what we should be doing. So I think that that to say that it's a matter of virtue is not to say that it's a matter of that it's unimportant or that it's impossible to change. But I do think it's going to then set the bar much higher for individuals in positions of privilege and power to do otherwise and to model a kind of other kind of behavior.
Can I add another point? It seems to me that incivility doesn't come so much from vehemence of argument or extremism in arguing as from character assassination. That incivility is especially attacking the character of your opponent. And when you do that, you are trying to close off the argument. You're trying to prevent his argument from being given or being heard or being paid attention to. So character assassination is a way of ending argument and not a way of carrying it on. And it isn't that we argue too extremely, is that we're trying to close off the other person's point of view by attacking his character. And incivility especially comes from this nastiness of character assassination.
I mentioned in the talk that the phrase "beyond the pale" has an interesting history, and of course the origin of that phrase is it refers to the geographic pale around the city of Dublin, which was a geographical marker that was meant to distinguish the civilized English from the barbarous Irish who lived beyond the pale. So I think that, cancel culture is just so obviously enacting that kind of othering and exclusion. But on this point about ad hominem, Harvey, I think that that's absolutely right. I also think that it's just possible to say, I'm going to disagree with you quite strongly that modern progressive Democrats deny the distinctiveness of America. I think they have a really strong sense of the distinctiveness of America as having this kind of original sin of slavery and racial inequality. And so this idea that then what we need to do is eliminate that original sin of racism. I guess the Williams perspective just says that maybe we need a little sort of radical Protestant in our lives. I write, everyone is sinful. Everyone is damned in this respect. We all have this original sin. So what kind of life is possible together on those terms without sort of imagining that the world and people could be radically otherwise? And it's only in accepting that as the world in which we live that we can then embark upon changing it.
All right, I accept that modification. The progressives don't say that America is no better than other countries, but much worse.
I think there was a question.
Hi, my name is Jan Schmidt, and I'm actually a descendant of Roger Williams.
There are so many of you.
Yeah.
Every talk I give.
I wish I read up more about him, but I think a lot of today's problems stem from the disintegration of the family and talking around the dinner table, where now we're afraid to talk to that uncle or that niece because we've just been doing our own thing, and nobody sits around with people who they really love and listen to where they're coming from and their opposing views, and from a standpoint of loving each other and then being able to accept each other and find that middle ground or be able to compromise, like this gal was asking about. People don't know how to compromise anymore. They're in their little bubble, and they're afraid to talk, or they end up screaming. And I think a lot of that stems from families who don't encourage that discussion around the dinner table. So.
Tom, I think that one's for you first.
Yeah, that seems plausible to me. the point about the family, they're making a difference. The fact that families are, in some respects, different now than
William Zipperer from Mesa. Kelly, Dr. Kelly, could you comment on who's going to adjudicate the social media comments? What's your feelings about making life more civil on Facebook and Twitter? How are these companies going to manage that?
How are they going to do it? I mean, how should they do it? I personally am a bit worried about how well they'll do it. I think Silicon Valley has certain political biases. I read them playing a role. I don't have any particularly good, strong policy prescriptions. Generally speaking, with respect to online stuff, I am at least as worried about measures to restrict content as I'm at least as worried about that, or to try to restrict what's said in these various contexts. Although I certainly agree there are costs. You know, people say things that don't help the conversation, hurt the conversation, and so on. Misleading stuff is put out there. But I tend to be at least as worried about doing something quite substantive in terms of restricting content in these contexts. But I agree, I mean, there's lots to be said on both sides of that question. That's just my personal immediate reaction.
I think that there's been this, we've swung from technocratic utopianism and eternal optimism to an extreme pessimism about the possibilities of the internet. You know, the sort of we should ban Snapchat and shut the whole thing down. I mean, I'm of the view, again, that in order to rebuild, you know, talking about institutions again, as Jonathan Rauch was talking about, sort of trying to, in our own lives, in our own work, building conversational contexts where people can engage around, in my case, a text in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. So for example, my favorite thing that I do in my job at Oxford is I run a Plato reading group for students, just students and faculty and whomever, and actually members of the community who want to come and just read a Socratic dialogue together out loud. Actually, Harvey, right now we're reading the Laches and talking about manliness and toxic masculinity. And people coming to this text are coming to it with wildly different political and ideological orientations. And yet, because they're talking about the text and they're the people who are associating on the basis of saying reading Plato on a Thursday night is something I'd like to do, they then begin to experience that as a kind of enjoyable activity that builds a sense of solidarity that's not ideal. I mean, these are labor and resource intensive spaces. But again, I just think that instead of wringing our hands, we need to think about creating spaces for people to have fun doing something else to make it pleasurable and also virtuous.
One thing that a valuable institution does is to slow things down with due process. And one of the great troubles of social media is that it's too quick. It encourages and rewards impulsiveness.
Yes, this question is for Teresa, and I pray my question is clear, but there is a question to civility as it not be revolving around fetish of words, but a commitment to using the words, this translating as posing disagreements to their face as opposed to behind their back. I notice this problem on being new social media enabling the advertisement of civility in a vein where the actual expression of even mere civility offline is impossible, notably the advertisements of marriages and childbirth. Years ago, this communication was reserved for the wealthy, and now I foreshadow a polarization of these nuptial benefits missing in the conversation. I just wanted to know what you thought about that as it refers to especially young people trying to make friends and navigate maturity, what that kind of polarization might look like.
So can you just clarify, so is the idea that people display their marriages and children online? And it becomes, and there's a kind of division between those who have and those who have not, or?
Yeah, it becomes kind of like a game of like playing house, I think, for young people, instead of pursuing excellence and adult things. Like, I feel like, I mean, I'm a single 33-year-old, and my Facebook page is plagued with women I don't even know that are like getting married, and I know.
Good
like,
for you.
So I have no idea why, you know, and I'm just wondering, like, I mean, what kind of polarization, like, does that translate as? I mean, like, it's just like it's a form. It's like natural. You know what I mean? It's like a reproductive cycle, but it's like that's not necessarily a part of that's not civil dialogue. I just feel very polarized and
Yeah. So
being bathed in that.
So I don't know if I have a thought directly to that case. I mean, I'll just say I'm a 34-year-old unmarried woman, so here we go. But I would say that it's part of, again, display culture, as what was discussed earlier, but the idea that joys like the joy of marriage, the joy of having children, are unadulterated joys, or if there are inconveniences attached, they're funny. They can be made the subject of a sort of internet joke, or we sort of, put up a picture of the mess that little Jimmy made, and we can all laugh about this, right? I worry, again, it's just a part of it's the presentation of a life without suffering and struggle and the just sort of everyday business of muddling and bearing through. That I think that presentation does to make those on the outside feel as though they're sort of missing out or sort of being excluded from some kind of in-group of joy.
Especially in the victims' rights for victims of sexual assault. I mean, like, I just don't know how they can share in that joy when they're healing, you know.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have an answer. I suppose what I would hope for, again, is just a willingness to acknowledge first and then possibly celebrate the, human condition as it is, which is a condition of suffering and loneliness and struggle, but that's made bearable by sharing in a common life with others. That doesn't get represented through pictures online. That's sort of why we like looking at
pictures at
online.
all.
Or pictures at all. Yeah, or pictures at all.
You'll feel better once you're married, Teresa. Maybe.
Yeah, but
Well, I was going to say it's
until
possible.
then, it's not a display.
It remains
you know?
possible to quit Facebook anytime.
Let me just say, I'm very happy in my solitudinous suffering. I
sorry,
find this very character building.
I haven't really developed the question, but I thought I would throw it out there anyways.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you for
thank
that.
you. We have time for one more, but it's going to have to be pithy.
All right. I have a question for Dr. Mansfield, and it was on, he brought up, the Tocquevillian perspective that as we move forward, society will get ever more democratic. So I did want to really ask him, do you think Tocqueville was correct in saying that it is inevitable? Do you think that, as Dr. Rausch presented, we might be able to kind of chain this with, institutional progress that'll prevent, the devolution into demagoguery? Or do you think that it really is inevitable? And then if we're headed in the noble, pure, true democracy, or the ignoble, tyrannical democracy that Tocqueville feared?
Good question, which is a prelude to a dodgy answer. Yes, Tocqueville gives us both promises and warnings. And so the promise is that we're in a democratic era, which is going to become more so. But the warning is to be careful that we don't produce a democratic tyranny instead of democratic liberty. And then there's a responding promise that one particular remedy that we have and great resource in America is our practice and our understanding of the art and science of association. So we aren't just suffering, unhappy individuals.
So we find joy in common life with others.
Yes, that's right, other suffering people.
Yeah.
So that'll make you feel better.
Can I, just
We'll
on a,
have the last word.
can I push something against Harvey? So I really like
Always.
I really like this appeal to Aristotle. I love this appeal to the sort of fundamental condition of partisan division in a polis. I wonder, though, whether the picture you paint is a bit too rosy, which is I think that Aristotle would define the current situation in American politics as one of stasis. Which is often translated as civil war or faction, but actually these are not great translations because stasis in Greek actually just means standing, and a kind of standing apart. So it's the idea that, in modern Greek it's the word for bus stop, which I always really like. But the idea where we're not actually kind of parts of the same whole at all any longer. We're not in that, we're different wholes. And so then, what's possible then, Aristotle would say, well, at that point, the polis has died.
You're getting the last word.
Well, I think the highlight of the common theme of the panel it has to do with this point about the indestructibility of your opponent's opinion, and how maybe we should think more about living with disagreement instead of assuming we have to search for agreement all the time. Thanks to all of you, and please thank the panel.